Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. Game week number 8 is here in Happy Valley, and it's a big one. Ohio State is visiting Beaver Stadium for a noon kickoff this Saturday. Penn State at 7-0, Ohio State at 6-1, Penn State at number 3 in national rankings, Ohio State at number 4. There's a lot at stake in this one, although, as we'll discuss a little bit later, different dynamics because of the new college football playoff reality compared to this matchup and maybe what it meant in terms of ramifications in recent seasons. We'll look ahead to the Ohio State game, start to set the stage a little bit for what is going to be a very eventful weekend here on campus. A bunch of national shows making their way here for pregame coverage. We'll be here all week bringing you the latest from Penn State. We'll be back at practice on Wednesday. We were back in Beaver Stadium on Monday with James Franklin, and to break down that, some key thoughts from the Wisconsin matchup. And again, setting things up for this Ohio State showdown, I welcome back on Mark Bredin and Daniel Gallen, colleagues at Lions247.com and guys who were out in the stadium, Camp Randall, to watch Penn State improve to 7-0 on Saturday night. Mark, we had Daniel on with us from somewhere between Madison and Milwaukee, wherever his hotel room was, on Saturday late night for our post-game podcast from that 28-13 victory for the Nittany Lions. Let's start with you and your general observations, takeaways from what was a 15-point Nittany Lions victory that required some obstacle overcoming along the way.
Yeah, number one, driving back to Chicago after that game seemed like a good idea in advance and did not seem like a good idea as I was doing it, but it was good in the morning when I was able to get onto the plane pretty quickly. But, number one, I mean, if these slow starts continue, they are going to cost Penn State. I thought this might be the game where it caught up to them, and obviously Penn State was just too good, and the Wisconsin offense was just, not very good whatsoever. Number two, resiliency. We could talk all we want about slow starts, but the key isn't how you start, it's how you finish. And this team has showed a level of resiliency that I haven't seen around here in a long time. Maybe since those Trace McSorley teams, when they just found a way to kind of will themselves to wins. Number three, there's a big difference in having confidence in your backup quarterback and thinking you have a good backup quarterback. That was a lesson we learned in 2021 at Iowa, when Sean Clifford was hurt and Taquan Roberson went in and against an overmatched team, in my opinion. Penn State was leading pretty comfortably in that game and completely fell apart. And you go to Wisconsin, that's not a top 5 or top 10 team, but that's a legitimate team coming off a series of wins, a tough team, a team with tradition, a great atmosphere, much like Iowa. You have to go to your backup quarterback. They had confidence in Bo Pribula. They thought he could get the job done. Now they know he can get the job done. So that, to me, they are better off at quarterback now. You never want to see somebody get banged up, but they are in a better position at quarterback now than they were going into that game, because now all of a sudden you know that your backup quarterback can produce. You know he can go in there and get the job done. So those are I know you guys went into some great depth, and I appreciate you staying up so late doing that, and I'm sure the fans do as well. But those are a few of the things. I don't want to get too much into it because I know we have a lot to talk about, but you guys covered so much stuff. But those are the things, just quick hitters, that kind of popped out to me.
I was thinking about this today, driving back from Beaver Stadium, about how Penn State fans on our message board and everywhere else would be feeling about the possibility of needing to turn to Bo Pribula this Saturday against Ohio State if Aller had suffered his injury with 2 minutes left in regulation, and we didn't really see Bo come in and do any heavy lifting. And he certainly was a key reason why they picked up the victory on Saturday. With that in mind, the staff did name him the offensive player of the game coming out of that victory over Wisconsin. And Daniel, we spent a lot of time discussing what Bo was able to do in an adverse situation, with the crowd really feeling energized, with Wisconsin ahead on the scoreboard, with Penn State searching for answers on offense after a couple punts. Bo Pribula leads 2 lengthy touchdown drives, doesn't turn the ball over. He's a threat with his wheels. That seemed to open some things for the running backs, and he made some really timely passes. So that body of work earned him player of the week from the staff. What kind of mindset are you in when it comes to Bo Pribula? We'll talk about Drew Aller in a moment, but how do you feel about him facing Ohio State versus going into this matchup last Saturday before we got that long look at Pribula, how you might have felt otherwise?
Yeah, like Mark said, in terms of travel logistics, I felt good about mine until I went down for a 20-minute nap yesterday afternoon and woke up 3 hours later. So I was in a similar boat. But no, Tyler, I agree with you that the framing of it is, how would you feel if Aller's injury came with 2 minutes left in the game and we didn't see a complete half from Bo Pribula? And that was, I asked James Franklin a question today where I was like, this is the most that we ever saw Bo throw. His career high for attempts in a game before Saturday was 9. And on the season, I believe he only had 10 attempts and he threw it 13 times in that game. Part of that is just because of the game flow. When Bo Pribula came into those games, a lot of it was, the 4-minute offense and salting games away, the end of blowouts, everything like that. And so this was just a completely different environment that we'd never seen Bo Pribula in. And I think coming out of it, I felt good. I think he made some of those tough throws. He's not going to be able to rocket it downfield like Drew Aller can. When you talk about adjusting the playbook and playing the strengths, I don't necessarily know if those 50-yarders to Omari Evans make the transition to the playbook with Pribula in there. But he showed he could do a lot of different nice things. And Franklin made the point that you talk about how Pribula's presence affects opposing defenses in the running game because of his legs. That also affects them in the passing game with his legs because of his ability to extend plays. If you're going up against a man look, you've got a lot of guys with their backs turned. Potentially, you can steal some extra yards with your legs there. So I think that coming out of it, I feel good. My bold prediction during the bye week was to pick Penn State to beat Ohio State. I was obviously thinking about that in the context of Drew Aller as Penn State's starting quarterback. So we'll see how this week goes, and maybe I'll have to reconsider a little bit. But I think overall, my feeling on the game just didn't really change too dramatically. I think that the fact that Pribula showed that kind of, maybe the floor is a little bit lower, but I thought that was potentially a good starting point with Pribula of coming into an adverse situation, performing like that.
We'll get into more on the quarterback situation, what we heard from James Franklin about quarterback Drew Aller on Monday in just a moment. But the defensive player of the game from Penn State staff was Jalen Reed. And Mark, I know Jalen felt like he was a bit disrespected, not making the all Big Ten list last year as a key member of an elite defensive unit. Right now, he's got All-American energy around him. What he's producing on a consistent basis now, game-changing play with the pick six that put Penn State in front, gave Pribula an opportunity to operate the offense with a lead instead of a deficit. And he's a guy that just seems to answer the call week to week to week now. And you throw in the fact that they lost Kevin Winston Jr. About 5-6 weeks ago, and he is still making this kind of a case. It says a lot about him as a senior.
Yeah, those of us who have seen him have come to expect it, some to expect it more than others. As we're sitting in the press box, as that defensive series was starting, Daniel said something to the effect of, this is where Jalen Reed steps up and makes a big play or something. Am I quoting you accurately, Daniel?
It's something along those lines.
Yeah, and then as that play was shaping up, I said, this is going to be it. Because you could see what he was doing. He was creeping up near the line of scrimmage, and he's blitzed so much from that you're thinking, with this quarterback who was so scattershot, if he drops back, he's not going to see him. And sure enough, it unfolded right in front of us. And that isn't some, great prognostication by us, although, Daniel had it first, but you've come to expect big plays from this guy. And I just think he is so important to this defense and what he does. I think I made Abdul Carter, my first half MVP. But when you look at what this guy does play in and play out, and that he does it all over the field, a very easy argument could be made for him as the best player. And it's not just the plays that he makes, it's the attitude. It's the tone that he sets. It's all of these things, the intangibles. It's really hard to quantify a lot of what he does. But that you could quantify easily. A pick six that changed the course of the game. Jalen Reed outscored Wisconsin 6-3 in the second half.
Good point. Good point there. And Jalen Reed, to your point about him getting it done all over the field, he leads this team in tackles. interceptions in back-to-back games. He, of course, had the one late in regulation against USC to put the opportunity for a game-winning field goal out of reach for the Trojans, give them a chance for a Hail Mary attempt. He also leads all defensive backs with 3.5 tackles for a loss. He's been an outstanding blitzer. Really seen that since game one reflected. And by the way, special teams players of the week probably went under your radar, probably went under my radar. Luke Reynolds and Dominic Ruley, a couple of backup components on offense, getting a little love for what they did on special teams. But let's dive into some of the takeaways from James Franklin's Monday press conference. And we'll begin, as mentioned, at quarterback. And Daniel, kind of what we expected to hear from James Franklin, I suppose, in terms of this is a situation that could go all the way up to 11:58 when they're about to kick off in this game at Beaver Stadium. And you know why James Franklin would feel motivated to make sure that's out there, because Ohio State's going to have to prepare for two quite different quarterbacks and playing styles and what that might mean for what Andy Kotelnicki is going to do from a schematic standpoint. So that's a lot on the plate for those coaches and players in Columbus to deal with defensively this week. But anything else that you took away from some brief commentary on Franklin on Aller in terms of he's the veteran, he doesn't necessarily need to bag a bunch of practice time, and regardless of Drew, they got to get a lot of QB1 work to Bo Pribula with that primary offense over the course of this week.
Yeah, I do want to point out that you missed Cooper Cousins among the special teams players of the game.
Whoops.
So Penn State went 3 deep there. And
hey, what does that tell you about their punting though in that game, in their return game? You know what I'm saying? Sorry, Daniel, but that I saw that, and kudos to those guys. But there were some issues on special teams in that game. I know we've moved on, but there were some issues.
Yeah, and cool honor for Dominic Ruley. I believe he was also one of the game captains. That's a walk-on who was the outstanding run-on last year and has gotten. We see him get a lot of work in practice. And Landon Tangwall had a tweet about him on Friday about how cool that is to see that for someone like that. But moving on to Drew Aller and his situation, I do think that James Franklin is going to run it up as late as he can. I don't know if that means it'll be when they announce the starters on the video board, if it'll be after that, if it won't be till the first series, whenever that comes. And I do think that I'm typically of the mindset that a lot of times it doesn't matter who the starting quarterback is in terms of playing these sorts of mind games. But in this case, it does matter because the two are so totally different in their playing styles, even though they are running the same offense. So I do think that Penn State will try to milk this for whatever advantage that they can. I thought Franklin's comments about Aller's being able to lean on his experience in terms of not necessarily needing as many reps during the week. I think that makes sense when you talk about, okay, let's do whatever we can to get this guy to Saturday, see what we can do to get him healthy and be able to do as much as he can on the field. I think that's a bit of a luxury to have with experience, that he doesn't necessarily need to take every single rep out there during the week. And we know that with Pribula, you always talk about the backup being one heartbeat away. I think he's a little bit closer than that this week, even if Aller were to play, based off of what we saw on Saturday. So it'll be interesting to see what we see on Wednesday night when we get our look into practice, what James Franklin has to say afterwards and how things are kind of managed up until kickoff on Saturday.
You mentioned it. We'll be back on the practice field Wednesday. It's our one on-field look at the Nittany Lions during Ohio State week. And we'll see if Drew Aller's out there leading drills, running around, hitting pads, or if he's just out there or if he's not out there. Regardless, we're going to have updates for you at lions247.com. And Mark, obviously, you'd love to have QB1 available for this game, and you'd like to know it here on a Monday. But the fact that maybe there's some uncertainty about it here in Happy Valley, there's certainly uncertainty about it in Columbus. Regardless if Drew Aller is starting or not, doesn't it seem like the stage is set for Andy Kotelnicki to utilize Bo Pribula in a variety of ways, make sure he's involved out there, maybe to take off some of the pressure physically on Drew Aller, but certainly to throw as many wrenches into Ohio State's pre-snap plans as possible?
Yeah, we had Tom Bradley, former Penn State defensive coordinator, on our Nitwits TV show that taped on Sunday night, and he was talking about it from a defensive coordinator's perspective what a challenge this is going to be, because as Daniel mentioned, this isn't like the NFL where you can just basically sign quarterbacks who are very much alike. Typically, it's not always the case, but in the NFL, typically you'll get a backup quarterback who does a lot of the same things well that your starting quarterback does. These guys are different enough that it's going to be very difficult for them. And Tyler, I think you make a great point. Now that he's gone out and proved that he can do it, I mean, he had not been throwing the ball that much, but he made some really nice throws. There were a couple dicey ones in there, but once he got going, I mean, I thought that play he made to Dinkins, that wasn't necessarily a great throw, but it was a great read, and he was patient and waited for him to come open. So now you know that he can do that as well. And we've seen Nittany, when he reaches into his bag of tricks, if he realizes that Pribula can do even more, it's going to be fun to watch to see what else he's able to come up with. And, think about that game. You had Drew Aller taking a snap. You had Bo Pribula taking a snap. You had Tyler Warren taking a snap. You had Singleton taking a snap. You had Katron Allen taking a snap. So, to your point, you have an offensive coordinator who is equipped to take all these weapons and do fun and creative and effective things with them. And I think this is only going to make the offense that much better if Aller's healthy. By the way, I'm just going to tell you, even if Aller were 100% right now, in or out, we wouldn't know until the beginning of the game. And that's as it should be. If you have that, use it. That's gamesmanship. Use it.
Yeah, and the fact that we didn't hear anything about long-term about Drew Aller, everyone can maybe breathe a little sigh of relief there. We'll keep tabs on it in the next few days just to kind of readdress what actually happened on Saturday. Aller appeared to take a shot while it was late in the first half. Following that sack, didn't seem comfortable. Didn't seem like he was able to step into those throws when he had an opportunity to do that late. Got a head start on his teammates and the coaches toward the locker room, was limping, came back after halftime wearing a knee brace on the left side, participated in a little bit of warm-up throwing action, and was ultimately determined he was not going to be a go at quarterback the rest of the way, which meant freshman Ethan Grunkemeyer was QB2 in Madison for the second half. And James Franklin brought him up and saying, probably need to make sure we're getting the appropriate amount of work to Grunkemeyer this week as well, even though that's difficult to do in a game week when you're trying to get all your first teamers sharp. The freshman has not played in the game, but if Drew Aller was unavailable against Ohio State, he would be QB2 on Saturday. We got another update in the injury department on Denai Dennis Sutton, and very much like he phrased it with Drew Aller, James Franklin says it's too early in the week to tell how this one's going to play out come Saturday at noon. But he says every time he's walked by the training part of the facility this week, Denai Dennis Sutton's there, putting in the necessary work the last couple of days. He tried to give it a go coming out of halftime. I believe he was out there for the very first defensive snap of the second half, and then must have had the self-awareness to say this is not going to be a smart move for me or the team. Went to the sideline. He was sidelined the rest of the way. We talked about it going into the game. Him and Abdul Carter had really begun to generate momentum early on in Big Ten play. We'll learn about his availability later in the week. We'll keep an eye on him at practice. But what do you make of that defensive end situation with Abdul Carter as the starter opposite, but the depth that may need to be relied upon against a top opponent in Ohio State?
Definitely. James Franklin alluded to it in talking about Smith Vilbert, about how the depth picture at defensive end changed during the offseason. You had Zariah Fisher's injury and Nittany Lions' dismissal, and that changed the outlook there. Franklin framed it as Smith Vilbert, like he told you, Tyler, was prepared to move to defensive tackle and was making the changes to his body to make that switch. And then as the defensive tackle depth came together, Franklin mentioned Alonzo Ford as someone that they didn't know what they were going to get out of coming off an injury. As that came together, they decided to move Vilbert back to defensive end, and he's shed some weight. Franklin said that he's looked a little bit quicker out there, and he's someone that if Dennis Sutton can't go, then they would need him. Vilbert played a season-high 28 snaps. Amin Vanover also set a season-high with 40 snaps. He didn't record any statistics, but according to PFF, they credited him with 5 pressures. And he's someone that whenever he's on the field, it seems like he's around the ball, flying around out there one way or the other. So it'll be interesting to see how that settles in, depending on what Denai Dennis Sutton's status is. And you have to think that even if he goes, that there's a chance you could see more of those guys, given what that injury looked like and how Nittany was moving after the game. And then the other name to watch there is Max Granville, the freshman who got in for a handful of snaps late. That was his second career appearance. Franklin said that they want to keep the red shirt as an option for him. They'd have 2 more games with 5 left in the regular season. But he said that if it comes down to it and they need Max Granville to play to win, they're on board with it. Max Granville is on board with it. And that's something that they're prepared to do. He's someone that we definitely talked about earlier this year that we would have liked to get a long look at in the non-conference slate, given his background as someone who reclassified from the class of 2025 really late in the summer. He had that big hit in Kent State that got, I believe, what was a forced fumble, but then ruled an incompletion. So he's flashed a little bit already. So those are the 3 names to know as we wonder what Nittany Dennis Sutton's status might be for Saturday.
We've heard from a few different folks about the Chop Robinson comparisons early on for Granville, but as a reminder, as Daniel referenced, he's supposed to be a high school senior right now. So if he's got to step up for you against Ohio State, that's a big moment for the freshman defensive end. The other name that we want to get to here, because like Dennis Sutton, he spent a lot of the game on the sideline last Saturday night. That's Anthony Donko. Unfortunately, this has been a bit of a recurring theme for him in Big Ten action. He was sidelined for much of the UCLA game, led to a lot of work for Nolan Rucci. He was out there essentially full go for the USC matchup, but there was late in regulation. He briefly exited, appeared to be shaken up, but he got back involved. He was the right tackle during the overtime period in Los Angeles. But Nolan Rucci, for most of Saturday night, back in his old stadium as a Wisconsin transfer, was the right tackle for Penn State. Daniel did a great job in our post-game podcast, Mark, of pointing out to me that Donka actually did resurface on the field during the second half as an extra lineman in a couple instances. So I guess there's confidence that he can play, but to what effectiveness is a question mark. And let's be honest, Mark, we have seen Ohio State do some serious damage off the edge in these matchups in years past to derail Penn State's hopes for victories. So when you got one tackle situation here, circle with an injury issue on a week like this, it's going to warrant some attention.
Yeah, I think Ohio State has a defensive end who's in his 18th year. What's it? Tui, pronounce it for me, Daniel. You help me out on this.
I spelled it right on the first try in the notes, but I haven't done my yearly look up the pronunciation. You can just call him JTT.
Number 44. That's how I remember him from a couple years ago when he absolutely dominated at Penn State against some pretty good defensive or some decent offensive linemen. So, yeah, I mean, I think the fact that Rucci came out and played pretty well in that situation was a very good sign. But to me, this is exactly the kind of game where you hope you could have all of that depth. Penn State's at a spot now, we've talked about it. When Franklin first arrived, they had to invade the defensive line for offensive linemen. So they're to the point now where the last couple of years they've had 5 pretty good starting offensive linemen. And this year they have the depth, which has really proved helpful. But I think against a team of this caliber, if Penn State wants to keep being that team that's able to dominate in the fourth quarter, the more effective offensive linemen you have, the better. And I think that's where having Donko is going to be really important for them in terms of getting that ground game going. And by the way, I was really impressed. I didn't really notice the numbers in that Wisconsin game, what Penn State was able to do and kind of imposing its will with the running game with Kaytron Allen late. But that was some really impressive stuff, and I think bodes well for the remainder of the season.
JT Tuimoloau is, I believe, the correct pronunciation there. You guys talking gave me.
He's a hell of a player. He's great. Yeah. Take no offense in us not being able to pronounce it. He is tremendous.
And yeah, we all know what happened. That was the last time Ohio State visited Happy Valley here, and he was a real problem. Really tipped the scales. We don't need to go down that road again.
How's he not in the NFL? I mean, based on that game.
Yeah, he puts it. That's probably still his career game right now. A couple of years later, I think he's at 4 sacks on the season right now. But that is his career game still at this stage. And we'll see if Penn State can help neutralize him a bit. And if Anthony Donko's available to do it, Nolan Rucci's going to get a lot of work this week in practice. It sounds like Donko's a guy that's been in that training room, according to James Franklin, trying to get right early in the week. Will that make the difference come Saturday? We'll learn about that. We'll be in the stadium very early. We'll have our binoculars. So Lions247.com will be the place to check in Saturday morning pregame regarding a lot of these availability concerns. Daniel, looking back at the Wisconsin matchup before we totally dive into what lies ahead of us here with Ohio State coming to town, offensively, defensively, you've had a chance here to think about this game, to write about a bit. Any takeaways that you'd like to discuss here on the show?
Yeah, I think the one thing that continues to stand out to me is echoing what James Franklin said a little bit about being a gutsy win. I just think that the way that Penn State navigated the adversity that they saw throughout the game, and the fact that they didn't play a clean game. I know Mark brought up special teams. I ended up giving a special teams game ball to Riley Thompson, but that was really second half. He pinned Wisconsin back, and I think that helped set up Jalen Reed's pick six. At least that was my justification for the game ball. But I just think that to be on the road in that sort of environment and to really be able to pick your way through that was impressive to me, because it's just one of those games where sometimes you feel like one guy goes down, then another guy goes down, that things can really snowball. And it just didn't happen there. And I was thinking back to what Drew Aller was saying in August about that being a real key focus for him, was to not worry about the little things and being able to move on from plays when something goes wrong, as we saw against Ohio State and Michigan last year. That didn't really seem like it was that was the case. And so I think to see that, we saw that from him on an individual level, where he's going into the locker room. You can tell he's emotional. He jaws back at the fans on the sideline. He comes back in, TV copy. He looks clearly emotional, before the start of the third quarter. But then he is that cheerleader on the sideline, still trying to direct traffic, still really engaged. I think that, seeing that from the off-field perspective for him, not letting that snowball, stood out to me. And then the whole team kind of taking that on and not letting things get out of control or, go too far. I just think that as I think about it, that these, 2 days later, that's what stands out to me, is that they were able to work through those situations in a very impressive way. I think that says a lot about this team at this juncture.
One thing I just wanted to note is it's going to sound funny coming off of a matchup a couple weeks ago when they had one guy get 20 targets and 17 catches. But I appreciate that they are not forced to lean on one particular pass target. It has seemed like in recent years for Penn State's passing game, you may have brought this up on the post-game podcast, Daniel, but there's been one, maybe two guys where if it's money time, it's got to be them, or you have trouble. You have trouble actually generating something. And right now this year, there's been several circumstances. It's a team that's trailed 3 times at halftime, where they've had to come out of the locker room in some gut check opportunities. And in this case, without their starting quarterback. And you see a variety of players stepping up. Liam Clifford with some key catches during Pribula's time on the field. I know that Harrison Wallace, isn't on pace for 1,000 yards, but he is somebody who consistently is making those catches, moving the change. 5 more catches today against Wisconsin, 3+ catches in every single game on the season. Tyler Warren was your leading target again, 7 catches on 8 targets for the day. But whether it's Nick Singleton getting involved as a receiver, guys like Liam Clifford and Julian Fleming, this wasn't an Omari Evans kind of game. It feels like he's kind of the point where he's due now to make a play, and maybe that happens against Ohio State. But, Mark, I guess my point is, it doesn't feel like you have to force it on being one guy. And maybe externally people think that's Tyler Warren. But we've now seen Penn State with do-or-die drives out in Southern California, with really important make-or-break momentum opportunities with Bo Pribula at quarterback. And they haven't shied away from distributing the football across this roster versus locking in on a guy or two. And I think that speaks to the trust that has been developed in some of the different corners of this offense that was not there clearly last fall.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think if you look at it kind of the other way, that's one of the things that I think made Bo Pribula's life easier, is that Andy Kotelnicki kept having him use different weapons, so they weren't able to focus directly on him. The other thing I would say is that, to me, Singleton's become an elite receiver as a running back. I mean, number one, that catch he made was fantastic, but it's not just that. He's running great routes. He's obviously getting in the right place at the right time where he needs to be. There were a couple plays that I thought they missed him against Wisconsin. So, you take what he can do in the ground game. And, I know people are saying, well, maybe he hasn't looked quite as explosive or whatever. I think you're going to see him break one soon. I really do. I just get that sense that the speed is still there. It's not lacking. I think maybe he just has to be a little bit more decisive. But what he's doing in the passing game, I think, is making him that much more of an attractive pro prospect, because he came in, he wasn't a great receiver. And now he's transformed himself into this guy who's making an impact in the receiving game every game. And then one last thing, I touched on it before. I love the fact that they didn't hesitate to just feed Katron Allen, because we've talked about it. I think Daniel was the first one to bring it up. You know what you're going to get out of Katron Allen. You may not get the 50, 60-yard run, but he is going to punish you and make you pay. And when you do that to a Wisconsin defense in the fourth quarter over and over and over again, you saw how they cracked. And it ultimately led to him scoring a touchdown. So I've been very high on Kotelnicki and what he's done, and I remain that way. This is going to be a big test this week, and I'm sure we'll talk about it all week. But to this point, he's been everything as advertised and more.
9 consecutive games where Nick Singleton has a reception of at least 13 yards, 5 touchdown catches during that 9-game span, to his credit. All right, Wisconsin games in the rearview mirror and fading fast, because it's Ohio State week, as I said, and a lot of confirmations have come in the last 24 to 36 hours about who's going to be joining us here in Happy Valley for this occasion. ESPN's College Game Day, Fox's Big Noon Kickoff pregame show, our good friend Josh Pate, all of them making the journey to State College to soak in the atmosphere before kickoff on Saturday. Daniel, it's shaping up to be one of those weeks here around campus, and we'll see if Penn State can deliver on the field. But this is one of those where you just got to kind of settle in, appreciate the big-time football vibes, and try to keep the main thing once that ball actually hits the air and this thing kicks off.
It's really exciting. And I think that you could tell in talking to some of the players post-game that they're excited about it too. I mean, talking to Jalen Reed and Nick Singleton, every once in a while you'll get some guys that can be pretty coach speak after wins, to be like, we're going to take our 24 hours and then tomorrow we'll turn the page. But Reed and Singleton were both in their different ways. We're both kind of like, yeah, we're excited, like, let's go, like, this is what it's all about. And so I think hearing James Franklin talk today, he knows the significance of this game, and I think that he knows everything around it. He made it clear that they're sticking to their process and they're not changing anything with media opportunities, anything like that, than would be from a normal week. I thought that the question was framed to him in a good way, where this is no longer just a game, like, it's going to be an event. And that's when you factor in all of the pregame shows. I'm sure all of the traffic that we'll start on Friday night and continue, post-game tailgating scene, everything like that. It's going to be beyond just those 60 minutes at Beaver Stadium. And so, I thought that it was a good answer from James Franklin. And I think over the course of his time at Penn State, you've seen him do a good job of keeping that 1-0 mentality. Every week's the Super Bowl, all of that stuff, and it's gotten them to the point where I think they're now 28-5 over the past 3 seasons. So we'll see what this looks like, but it's going to be exciting. I'm excited. When I woke up from my nap yesterday and started doing some prep work, I kind of brought some energy back. Feel like, okay, it's Ohio State week, big week for the program, exciting week just for us. But let's see what we got.
Mark, it's always a big game. It's Ohio State. Now, this time around, Penn State is more highly rated, which has kind of been the rarity in this series of late. But number 3 versus number 4 in the country, it's a big deal regardless of what standpoint you're trying to view it from. But this is also an Ohio State team that in their last 3 visits to Happy Valley, people were excited. There was buzz. There was thought that this could be the game, and they won all 3 of those games. The first time by 1 point, and when Chase Young put it away at the very final moment, and then the last couple a little more decisive. Overall, a 7-game win streak for the Buckeyes. The average margin of victory is 8 points. The first couple in this losing streak were 1-point losses. I know people are very tired of hearing Penn State's played Ohio State as tough as anyone who hasn't beaten them this decade. Mark, when you look at this matchup and what it means for the Nittany Lions, does any part of this buzz dissipate a bit when you remember, oh, right, there's a safety net of a 12-team playoff versus a 4-team playoff. And, oh, that's right, if you lose to Ohio State as a division opponent, you really don't have a chance to get to the Big Ten championship game. Now it's open to everybody in the conference. The top 2 will be in Indianapolis in December. So in your mind, is it any less of a big deal because of what college football has become?
Let me put it this way. If Penn State loses this game, do you think fans will be any less pissed off afterwards than they would have been last year? You know what I mean? I mean, they're going to be riled up. And the reason I say that is because Penn State has not been able to get over this hump. So regardless of what the overall landscape is, if this was a series where, they had alternated wins over the last few years, then I would say, sure, it's not that, Penn State could afford to lose it. And Penn State still can't afford to lose it. But I think from the perspective of what James Franklin is building, and you look at where this team is and what we expect this team to lose to the NFL draft, if you're not getting it done this year, when are you getting it done? And I'm just speaking the truth there. So sure, I mean, Penn State could lose this game and then go on to win the national title, and then everybody would forget about it. But I think in the moment, at this time, for Penn State to prove that it belongs in the top 5, it has to win this game.
Yeah,
I think it's important.
You win this game, and all of a sudden the expectation is you're in Indy playing for the Big Ten championship with a chance to earn a first-round bye week in the playoff versus, hey, help yourself out the rest of the way, get yourself as well-positioned as you can for a first-round home playoff game, and whoever that might be comes to Happy Valley if you can avoid any stumbles for the remainder of November. Kind of the same perspective question to you, Daniel. What do you make of the 2024 version of this matchup between Penn State and Ohio State, and ultimately its ramifications?
Yeah, I have 2 thoughts off the top. And the first is, you can sit here and game out, okay, if they lose, the path to the college football playoff is still there. You're still in good position. But as soon as you get to 12:06 or whenever the game will kick off on Saturday, it doesn't matter anymore. You want to win. The other thing too is that, when you sit there and you try to game things out like that, I feel like that's where you get in trouble. That's where you start to overthink. And, it's the same thing where people talk about, well, actually being the number 5 seed in the playoff might be better than being the number 4 because of you're seeing the G5 champion, whatever. I don't want to see Ashton Genty, even if I have a home game, I don't want that. So I think that you want to put yourself in the position to win as many games as possible in as few opportunities as possible. And that's what you do by beating Ohio State. I also think that, like Mark talked about, that, with what you're building, if you're James Franklin, you want to win this game and you need to win this game. So much of college football is about perception, and there's still a committee that is picking these teams. So much of what goes on in college football is still based on reputations, those sorts of things. And I think if you're James Franklin, if you're Penn State, you're still going to be regarded as in that second tier of the Big Ten. The way things that have gone a lot, especially in the old setup of the Big Ten, Penn State was the only team on that second tier for a long time. It would be Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, everybody else. And I think that if you're Penn State, you want to be up there with Oregon, with Ohio State. You want to be able to be in that same breath and not have people kind of be like, oh yeah, maybe they'll get them this year. Maybe this will be when they break through. But overall, being that, automatically penciled in as number 3. I think that if you want to continue to show your trajectory, show what you're capable of, I think that that's something else that comes with a win Saturday, beyond just positioning yourself better in the Big Ten, positioning yourself better for the college football playoff. I think that it's one of those things that could have, long reaching ramifications. I know, of course, that's what people thought in 2016, and we saw it happen in the series since then. But I just think that, if you're Penn State, if you win this, it's a big, big feather in your cap.
Not to mention the recruiting angle, and which we will dive into on our next episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast with Tyler Calvaruso. He'll give us the lowdown of top prospects who plan to be in Beaver Stadium on Saturday, what the Nittany Lions could gain from a victory over Ohio State entering the final stretch of their regular season. Remember, a lot of flip targets still out there that Penn State's aiming to impress, find edges with. I'd imagine that beating Ohio State and improving to 8-0 would be a nice little edge to establish. By the way, the Big Ten landscape right now, number 1 team in the country, Oregon, number 3 team in the country, Penn State, number 4, Ohio State. And then you've got that other Big Ten unbeaten lurking around, Indiana, 8-0 on the season, number 13 overall in the AP Top 25. Guys, we clearly have a fun week ahead of us of coverage at Lions247.com. We'll be back on the podcast with you two on Thursday to give our final look at this matchup, our predictions, any feedback that we come off the practice field with from what we saw, from what we heard from James Franklin on Wednesday. After that practice session, we will bring it to you here on the podcast. Between now and then, though, you're going to want to listen to our midweek episode, which will drop early on Wednesday. Tyler Calvaruso, as I said, will bring us the latest on the recruiting setup for Saturday's matchup. And then we'll also have a Buckeyes insider from within our 24/7 Sports Network to talk about the strengths, the weaknesses, and maybe the question marks still surrounding this 6-1 Buckeye squad. Daniel, Mark, appreciate the perspective. Fun one to follow this week, and we'll be doing it at Lions247.com. For now, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.